Reinvention is the key to overcome new challenges and keep growing. Welcome to South Summit 2020. A new networking platform with a revolutionary live TV format to access and connect from any device, anytime, and anywhere. Join South Summit 2020 and multiply your business opportunities.
Hello everyone, welcome everyone to this GovTech track. My name is Alex Barrera and it's my pleasure sharing the stage with every single one of you. I am very excited with this track because I am personally very connected with GovTech, and I think everyone is really going to enjoy. We have an incredible set of speakers, and this track is actually brought to you by the Public Tech Lab, which is a center at IE University aimed at empowering public administration digital transformation, which, by the way, it is much needed. It basically fosters the connections between GovTech startups, between public institutions, and advocates for experimentation and the development of new digital solutions. And hey, we are in Spain. We know how hard that is, right? So if we can do it, everyone can do it. Now, today, we're going to see a set of experts, leading practitioners, leading voices in the GovTech space that are going to share their perspectives on what's going on in the space. However, there's a big question. What is GovTech, right? Well, GovTech is the whole of government approach to public sector modernization. Basically promotes simple, accessible, and efficient government through the use of digital tools, which is not easy at all. Now, the emerging GovTech market it's been running for a while now. It's been quite well known in certain places. However, there's a reality that has happened upon us, which is called the pandemic, that has probably highlighted or accelerated the need and shown the need of the convergence between the innovation and the digital tools and our governments. Now, to talk about this, it is my pleasure to start introducing our first talk of the track, which we're going to start with a very broad perspective from a global perspective of GovTech. And to talk about that, about the GovTech and the global partnership, putting people first, I want to introduce our next two speakers. Coming on one side, Idoia Ortiz. She's the director of the Public Tech Lab. Idoia, pleasure having you with us here. And with Idoia, I want to also introduce Tracy Marie Lane, all the way from DC, I believe, and she's the leading practice manager at the World Bank. So Idoia, Tracy, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. What a hat, by the way. I like that. So yes, I'm Idoia. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here with Tracy. Actually, she is practice manager at the World Bank, but also she is leading the GovTech Global Partnership. And that's why she's here with us today. You can imagine that for those that we are trying hard to advocate for GovTech and to push this agenda forward, it's super important to have the World Bank with such an initiative. So let's start from there. What is the initiative about? What's the goal? Who is in? How we can be in the initiative? Let us know, please.
Thanks, Idoia, and nice to see you again. Thank you for inviting me to this agenda. Well, our take on GovTech is very consistent with the definition. For us, we like to emphasize three aspects: universal access and putting the citizen at the center. The second is the whole of government approach, the kind of integrated approach. And for us, the third is a public sector modernization that is simple, efficient, and transparent. So last year we set up the GovTech Global Partnership. For us, this is a partnership that brings together the public sector, the private sector, academics, and stakeholders. And it's much more than a financial relationship, but let me first mention that we do have a multi-donor trust fund and some financial contributions that are coming from governments of Austria, Korea, and Switzerland. But we also have very live ongoing conversations with practitioners in the UK, with Germany, and conversations about secondments and using exchange of knowledge as a way of kind of generating this broader partnership. So the goal is to put people first. That is at the center, so that we help clients when they're modernizing their public sectors to design their services with this in mind, so that we put the citizen at the front. So we do see a big role for the private sector. I know that's one of the aspects you mentioned early on. We're still at the beginning of developing this engagement, and this is at sort of multiple levels. One part of the partnership is to work at country level. So we've just issued a first call for proposals for grants that are going out at country level. So this is a new way to engage with local startups and local private sector firms. And for anybody who wants to get engaged, you can get to us at govtech@worldbank.org. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. And we welcome all new partners to come and share their knowledge and experience with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. We've been working in this space for 2 years now, and we see that, I mean, it's growing super fast, at least in Latin America, Spain, and Europe in general. So, I mean, you have said that you started with this initiative last year. Which are the main developments that you see in the GovTech space?
So that's we started pre-COVID, right? So we didn't really fully anticipate the full challenges and opportunities that this was going to impact on the demand. So as I said, the demand even before COVID was growing, and post the COVID situation, we see that even more accelerated. As I mentioned, we did a call for proposals ended last week, and we saw more than 70 applications. So many of the motivations that are coming from countries to adopt GovTech are varied. So they're from citizens' demand for public services and a need to respond to that, to fiscal constraints and a need to be more efficient, particularly with the current set of resources. So, a trend has been for a higher demand for core government services, which are, say, cloud-based, looking at cloud-based solutions. So a focus on financial management or human resource management systems, looking at those more efficient use of technology. We also see a trend towards more integrated service platforms, not something that's just in countries like Estonia and the UK, but Albania, Moldova, and Uganda are also looking into this trend. And Jordan has just launched an interface with a stronger partnership for, say, private sector and academics to also build on an open API development. So around the world, we do see that open data itself and a drive to more digital data in the public domain has led to private sector responses. So that's created a much more innovative set of applications, whether or not that's checking your timetable for public transportation options through to checking the weather. The COVID situation has also made some catalysts, right? We've seen video conferencing introduced in Kenya in the judicial sector, in Samoa in parliament, for example. So this has actually been something that's been a catalyst for reforms.
And my third question, and I think that is going to be the last one because we are quite tight with the time. So we, as I said before, we work in Europe and in Spain, but we also collaborate with Latin America, and we are starting some conversations with Africa. They always ask us, I mean, does GovTech work at all levels of digital maturity? Yes or no, very briefly, because I know that we have 1 minute more.
Yeah, yes, so for us, yes, I think it's a huge misconception that the GovTech is only in advanced or high-tech areas. And I think just on a personal note, I moved to Nairobi in 2007. So that was the year that the M-Pesa was launched, right? The mobile money platform in Nairobi. So for sure, these GovTech solutions are not coming from one direction to another, and they are across all levels of digital maturity.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This has been like super fast overview on how is the global GovTech situation. Now we're going to go a little bit more in the national level with Lithuania and their example. That it's an amazing example, very new, but I am sure that we're going to learn a lot from it. Thank you so much, Tracy.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Thank you very much, Idoia. I must say that I do agree with what Tracy just said. A spreadsheet the spreadsheet, having people going from pen and paper to a spreadsheet, that is wonderful. That fixes so many things, honestly. So definitely we don't need super high tech to deliver very good solutions around this. And as Idoia was saying a moment ago, we're gonna step a little deeper into the solution. And the big question here is, how do you do this? How do you actually implement a program around that? And precisely to talk about that, how to set up a GovTech program, we are going to Lithuania, one of my favorite countries, to be honest, all the way to Vilnius. So please welcome Beatriz Belmonte, Head of Service Design at IE Public Tech Lab, and Arune Matelite, GovTech Lab Manager at GovTech Lab Lithuania. Thank you very much. Hello, ladies.
Thank you very much, Alex. Hi, Arune, and welcome. So Arune is joining us from Vilnius, Lithuania, and we want to know a little bit more about this, the remarkable success that this GovTech Lab have experienced. We had the opportunity to chat a bit about your GovTech journey a few weeks ago, and you mentioned that it all started barely 2 years ago, and since then, you have been able not only to pilot the lab with government, but also to build a momentum in which interest and commitment to the project have surged. I would like you to tell us about the origin of this. How do you start a program like this? And why did you start it in the first place?
Yeah, well, hey, thanks for having me here. And actually, it started quite simply. So me and a few of my colleagues have been working on different digital government projects at the Ministry of Economy and Innovation in Lithuania. And what we noticed while doing other things related to open data and digital economy is that we have teams in Lithuania's public sector that are embracing innovation and experimentation, but still only a few, and they're very scattered around the public sector. So they are in different public sector institutions. So we have those few shining innovation stars, but the question is, how do we translate what they do and scale it to the whole public sector? And so we kind of saw this as a recurring problem, but also, if you will, an opportunity. And at the same time, we saw that many startup ecosystem players were interested in solving social and public sector challenges, but they saw a government as a very clumsy client, not someone that they want to work with, although it has that potential. So we looked around what's happening in Europe and beyond, and GovTech Lab came as a natural solution to us. We wanted to create a process of how governments can open up to startups and innovative companies and how we can encourage them to work together. So we pitched this idea to set up such team to Vice Minister and and also Ministry of Economy and Innovation in Lithuania, and they gave us a green light to just try and pilot it and see what happens. So that's kind of how we got started.
So you started with a lot of trust from your government. That's very good. Yeah. And now you are launching, I think, the second series of the challenges you work from the public sector to GovTech startups, but you also suggest solutions as well, and you co-create them. And we know it is not always easy to involve institutions in this kind of processes. We know it very well, but you have not only involved these institutions, you are actually piloting the initiative with them. How do you do that? How do you pilot a GovTech Lab?
Yeah, I think kind of few key steps and elements that we learned along the way really stand out. So the first one that might sound a little bit cliche, but I think that's the most important bit, is that you have to start small. So you cannot just immediately propose that you want to create a new government agency with 20, 30 people. And I don't think anyone would say yes to that without any proof of concept. And even if you're a politician or a high-level policy maker, public sector official that can make that decision, why would you create a new government agency without a proof of concept? So that's why I think we should start small with 1 or 2 people that maybe working on different projects at that time, but could give some time to trying and figure out what kind of projects we could do together. And we started the same. We started with like 3 challenges that 2 of them failed, and because we learned from that, why some challenges are interesting to startups and others are not. And if we started immediately with 10 or 15, we would not be able to do that. And the same with people. We we worked for the first 6 to 9 months, kind of the GovTech Lab didn't officially exist then. We just kind of were doing it, as one of the activities, and it was only established officially last December. And I think from that, kind of the second point is that there will never be a perfect time for innovation or perfect funding for innovation. So you have to look what kind of matches the best your goals. And even now, most of our team's funding is actually received to organize events. But that's kind of still not what we do. We organize that GovTech Challenge series, which we see as our main activity, but from the funding perspective, it's just like our side job. So I mean, and there's never going to be a perfect funding. So just looking for those opportunities and finding, is it supporting SMEs or emerging market in your country? I think that's kind of essential. I mean, keeping those ambitions and goals in mind, but having those small steps. And if we preach experimentation to public sector institutions, we have to be able to follow the same kind of logic and philosophy ourselves. If someone just top down kind of told us, you have to set up a GovTech agency, I don't know if those institutions would trust us if we wouldn't go to the process of experimentation together with them. So I think that's kind of two key things that help us understand where the institutions are at and why they're worried about certain things, and help us to build that and scale as well.
Absolutely, you need to walk the talk, right?
Yeah.
You were looking at other institutions, looking for inspiration, and now we want to get some inspiration from you. What do you think are the main factors that have played a key role in your success, and what, in your opinion, have you seen as being completely necessary in the build-up to systemic change, as you have done in Lithuania?
I think apart from the other two things that I mentioned before, kind of three elements were very important. So one, finding allies, communicating the uncertainty that we have every day, and also being a very good translator between the public and the private sector. So first, what I mean by building allies is that you have to allow people to be part of your movement. So when you're creating the lab, do not do that with like closed doors. Involve as many people as possible, even at the very early stage, the design stage, and if you can, at the decision-making stage, because especially if you have small team, they become the advocates and ambassadors for you, and they can scale the message so much more than you could. And I think secondly, these kind of projects are usually the first ones in the country, so you have to be bold about communicating it and not pretending that you know what you're doing. So use that to your advantage and say that you're experimenting, and together with other institutions, and that kind of allows you the space to make mistakes, but also makes the institutions more comfortable, because then everyone kind of finally understands that it is experimentation. It's not 100%. You're not going to deliver and implement every pilot that you do, because otherwise that would not be about innovation. So I think that's very important. And finally, that it's kind of very like transferable thing to other areas, but just making both public sector institutions and also the startups appreciate each other. So you have to at first be a translator, but then help them be more kind of empathetic to what each other do. And that's kind of why in our accelerator, we make them go to the same like workshops together, so they can see that the public sector can understand that startup might not have money next month. They have to earn their living. That's why they need to work in tighter deadlines. And maybe that's why they're more anxious to get the things doing. And startups have to understand the public sector officials. Sometimes they're responsible for like delivering essential public services. They cannot just suddenly stop doing what they're doing, and they're even legally responsible. And trying to kind of seeing and appreciating the differences, and that's essential. And for GovTech labs in different countries, that's definitely like what they need to master, and have that full picture of what different stakeholders are doing in their country.
Those are great learnings. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I would like to make the most of these seconds. You have evolved in so many ways, and we would like to know where are you now? Where are you heading next?
So as you mentioned, we are the second iteration of GovTech Challenge series, but what we're trying to do more effectively is not just help with the process, but try to fund the pilots as well. So we're happy that this summer, actually, Lithuania's government confirmed new kind of economy plan where we'll be able to fund pilot GovTech solutions around government. So we're trying to move into that more strategic direction and have more tools at our disposal. And I think that shows that, you can start from organizing a few GovTech events to being that kind of the key enabler in the GovTech ecosystem in the country. But, have to have those steps and cannot start immediately for, getting like 7 million to pilot solutions. You have to start from somewhere smaller and to just build it up.
Thank you so much, Arune, and we are looking forward to knowing more about the development of your project.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you very much, Bea. Thank you very much, Arune. It's a pleasure having you. And I was thinking, wow, I've been going a lot to the Baltics. It's probably one of my favorite areas in Europe. And when you look at the capacity they have to implement certain things in connection with the government, how much the government kind of collaborates with them. Same thing you can see in the Nordics, for example, with Finland and the way they are approaching how to implement AI education across the whole country. It's really fascinating. But precisely because of this, there are many, many different players that are kind of parts of this larger GovTech ecosystem. And to talk about that, we have someone that basically did a report on this, which, by the way, as a researcher and analyst, I love people that do these things. So I'm going to be very, very happy to introduce our next speakers and our next interview. So please welcome Sofia Silva. She's the GovTech specialist at IE Public Tech Lab. And joining her for the interview, Roy Saban, head of GovTech at Creators Israel, all the way from Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Hi, Roy.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. So, Roy, we were just talking about how GovTech programs are flourishing around the world, and you have just published a report on the leading GovTech programs at a global level. So, as a starting point, why don't you share with us very briefly some insights on the international landscape of GovTech programs? How does it look like? Is it diverse or particularly flourishing in a specific region or format?
So I think that looking at GovTech programs, they are very diverse. They're also a new kind of entrepreneurship framework, because if you would look like 5 years ago, I don't think you would see more than 2 to 3 programs. The average age of the programs that we analyzed was 2.5 years. So I think we could say this is something new. We see them coming up all over the world, mostly in Europe and Latin America, but also in the US, of course, in Canada, and also in Asia and Australia. So it's not something that only in one geographical area. It's all over the place. And also the models are really interesting, because it's not only governments, federal governments, also municipalities are working independently or joining forces with other municipalities to bring GovTech into their daily work. And we see that trend that is coming in more and more countries that are also joining this revolution. And it's not only the countries, I have to say, also universities are managing programs, also NGOs are managing programs, also the private sector sometimes manages GovTech programs, because I think that everyone sees the potential. This is the pre-COVID potential. I'm not talking the post-COVID, and I think will increase these kind of programs, and we will see more and more of them expand. So we see a lot of different programs, a lot of interesting programs. I want to say that I think that there's one thing that is common for all the programs, that they all have 3 main objectives. They all want to bring more education to the public sector, use these programs to educate civil servants to understand how to work with technology, how to work with startups, and how to be open-minded. The second thing is implementation. Most, if not all, of the programs want to, at the end, implement technology in the public sector and not only talk about it. And the third thing is ecosystem growth. Everyone wants to develop this kind of ecosystem in their country, bring more and more startups that are doing impact on the public sector. And I think that these 3 objectives, we will see them more and more coming into other countries that are not currently part of this ecosystem. And I think that we can start talking about also about a global ecosystem that is emerging. And the programs, each one of them are pushing one of these 3 objectives according to their strategic matters. But this is a really common thing that we see in all kind of programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really shows that GovTech programs are thriving. And I mean, we know that there's an obvious need for transformation in government. Public institutions have to renew their relationship with citizens, especially in terms of increasing transparency and efficiency. they must ensure the welfare state, and they have to prevent the private sector from embracing the provision of public services. So I would like to ask you, why do you think that these GovTech programs in particular are proving so relevant for these kind of government transformations?
So I think there are two aspects in that. First thing is the approach, and second thing is the facilitation. And I'll talk a few words firstly about the approach. So most, if not all, the programs adopted a challenge-based approach. It means that the public sector is part of the game by saying that we want you to say what's your problem and not talk about the solution. For the first time, governments are asked to say what they're specialized in, saying what are your problems and why they're a cure, and not also take responsibility about the solution, about the technology, because technology is evolving really quick, and not all of us, we can actually trace, understand all the technological trends and what's going on. But the government can say, look, this is my problem. I don't know what would be the solution, but once you'll bring the solution, I will probably know that it works because I know good enough my problem. And that keeps the public sector part of the game when we're talking about digital transformation. Because if you demand the public sector to say what's the solution, what kind of technology is needed, so usually you will get solutions that are not really adapted to what their needs, and you won't, and they won't know what kind of technologies are even there at the market. So I think this is a very good approach that all the programs took part of it and working on it, and I think that we see a lot of success because of this approach. The second thing is the facilitation. I think that once there's a program and there's someone who's managing the process and facilitating the entire process, the private sector and the public sector, when they meet, they have a common language because there's a person that translates the things that, like Arun mentioned before. And it's easier for both sides to understand what are the needs and what are the potential solutions. And that makes this whole process easier for everyone. And in a digital transformation age, it's really important because I saw, if you're talking about like 5 to 10 years ago, a lot of lectures of people coming to the public sector talking about technology, and the people didn't understand, the basic language or the basic vocabulary. And if you have a facilitator in the middle that helps both parties understand what are the capabilities, what are the advantages in working together, it makes the whole process easier and more effective.
Yeah, I think that argument is indeed like very compelling. And along these lines, talking about a new open innovation approach, the incentive for startups to enter the B2G market is huge. Governments are the largest employers, the biggest data owners, the largest service providers, and on top of that, they provide to the largest user base. They're bigger than Amazon, Facebook, or Google, because like not everyone shops at Amazon, but everyone's a citizen, right? So the incentive for startups to join these programs is enormous, but so are the barriers to work with public administration. So what can you tell us about the way these programs go around barriers to open innovation, like bureaucracy or a risk-averse culture or procurement complexities?
So I think that the key word for that is structure. All the programs have a clear structure for everyone. So if you're a startup that is entering this kind of program, you understand what are the phases that you will need to go through, what is the duration or the expected duration of this program. You're not starting something without knowing if it will take you 6 months, a year, or maybe 2 years. And also the public sector knows that this is a program that has an ending point and someone is helping them to go through the process. Many times public sector agencies or administrations do things like that by themselves, and it's pretty difficult. And once there's a structure, a clear structure, the application barriers are lower. There's a procurement process that is inside the entire process. So if you started working and applied for a challenge, you know that you won't need to go for another procurement process. And also you have a challenge owner at the end who is interested in solving the challenge that was presented. So I think all these things at the end reduce the barriers, reduce the entry barriers. There's more transparency that is seen, and it helps startups and also SMEs to come into these kinds of programs and say, okay, someone is taking care of me. I know what's going on, and I know that someone actually wants my solution at the end if it will be a really good solution. So that's also incentivizes these companies to work really hard and work with their partners at the public sector. I think that besides the structure issue, these programs also are doing also a marketing campaign for the government. They're showing them their best sides, and they're showing that governments can adopt and implement technology. And this is something very important because if you'll ask the private sector, the average CEO of the private sector, he will tell you that I won't work with the government. I don't know with who I need to talk to. I don't know how much time this process will take. It will probably take a lot of time. And the potential to expand my solution out to this government will be very difficult. And I think that once that we have these programs, most of these questions are answered and make the whole process more clear and more attractive to startups and companies that want to work with the public sector.
Yeah, I think those are actually great insights. And it is true that certain countries have eased the access for startups into government through that structure that you're mentioning. And much of it is because they understand how GovTech ecosystems work and the strategies or instruments that can foster them. And I think that Enrique Zapata, a GovTech expert at the Latin American Development Bank, can tell us more about the future of government. So I think we can leave the floor for him to tell us more about this. Thank you so much, Roy.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Thank you very much, Roy. Pleasure having you. Thank you for connecting with us. And as Sophia was just saying, it is true that some governments make it easier than others to do that. And so the question is, how are the governments going to evolve? What is the future of governments around that? And to talk about that, I'm going to switch to Spanish. Y vamos a hablar sobre el GovTech y el futuro del gobierno. Y para hablar de esto, tenemos a Rocío Suárez, especialista en startups del IE Public Tech Lab, y por supuesto un gran aplauso para Enrique Zapata, experto en inteligencia de datos y nuevas tecnologías en el CAF, Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, desde, entiendo, Ciudad de México, ¿verdad?
Es correcto, muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Qué bonito Ciudad de México, lo echo mucho de menos. Pues nada, Rocío, todo tuyo.
Genial, gracias. Bueno, pues nada, efectivamente, Enrique hoy se conecta desde México. Tenemos una gran variedad de nacionalidades y de ponentes. Y bueno, Enrique, como estábamos justo comentando, gran parte de la apertura de una nueva vía para transformación digital depende precisamente de que los estados comprendan, ¿no?, este ecosistema GovTech, los instrumentos, las estrategias y las iniciativas que apoyan su desarrollo. Así que bueno, aprovechando que acabáis de publicar el reciente informe GovTech y el futuro del gobierno, ¿nos puedes decir qué instrumentos habéis identificado como los más efectivos para promocionar estos ecosistemas? Entiendo que no se trata solo de promoción, sino de estrategias de innovación pública, promoción de la oferta de soluciones, promoción de la demanda a través de la compra pública. Así que genial si nos cuentas un poco más.
Justamente, no, muchas gracias, Rocío. Y creo que, lo que han dicho mis compañeros antes es mucho de lo que hemos visto tanto en el informe GovTech y el futuro del gobierno, que mañana lo van a poder consultar, y es un informe conjunto entre el Public Tech Lab y CAF, y otro producto que sacamos, que es el índice GovTech 2020. Lo que vemos es que no hay solo una serie de instrumentos que necesitas para apoyar los ecosistemas GovTech. En realidad necesitas un approach holístico a lo que es todo el ecosistema. Entonces, lo primero que hicimos fue ver cómo lo puedes caracterizar o cómo puedes modelar este ecosistema. Y básicamente el modelo GovTech tiene tres partes. Por un lado está el actor, uno de los actores principales, que es el gobierno. Por el otro lado está el segundo actor, que es el principal, que son las startups, las scale-ups y las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas digitales y centradas en datos que apoyan al gobierno. Y en medio de las dos están los vasos comunicantes, que son las contrataciones públicas, y los datos como insumo principal. Entonces, lo que hicimos fue darnos a la tarea de saber qué es lo que se necesita hacer desde cada una de estos tres ámbitos para apoyar el ecosistema. Temas en gobierno como tener una estrategia GovTech o un fondo GovTech o equipos GovTech que puedan canalizar y coordinar esfuerzos hacia un mismo objetivo. Desde el lado de las startups, tener, por ejemplo, cámaras o coaliciones que den una voz a un ecosistema que ahorita no tiene tanta potencia con el gobierno, o, por ejemplo, fomentar estrategias o verticales GovTech en fondos existentes o en aceleradoras. Y de la parte de los datos y de las contrataciones públicas, continuar fomentando, como bien decía Tracy, iniciativas de datos abiertos como principal insumo que utilizan las GovTech, e implementar nuevos esquemas de contrataciones que le permitan a las startups digitales entrar de mejor manera a venderle al gobierno.
Toda la razón. Muchas gracias. Bueno, y además, como lleváis mucho tiempo identificando barreras, ¿no? Y nos estás contando esta sensibilización a los gobiernos y a las startups sobre cómo llevar a cabo una colaboración finalmente exitosa, ¿cuáles son las barreras en las que crees que merece la pena que tanto los gobiernos como las startups hagan hincapié? Un poco los obstáculos que se encuentran.
Claro, en el informe que sale mañana identificamos 4 tipos generales de barrera. El primero son barreras culturales y políticas, y es lo que cualquier iniciativa de innovación se enfrenta cuando está tratando de hacer algo nuevo. Hay una resistencia humana natural al cambio, a hacer las cosas diferentes, a entender nuevos términos y a imaginarte el mundo de manera diferente. Y esto es definitivamente algo que pasa en materia de GovTech. Además, como estamos hablando de gobiernos, también tenemos la existencia de estructuras organizacionales burocráticas, culturas y regulaciones que limitan el actuar que pueden tener los hacedores del cambio, digamos, dentro del gobierno. Y a eso pues le puede sumar tanto auditores externos e internos que tienen los gobiernos y áreas jurídicas, ¿no? Que no es que sean reacios al cambio y no es que no les guste hacer innovación, sino que se sienten inseguros de hacer algo nuevo por miedo a poder caer en temas administrativos o hasta jurídicos. La segunda barrera tiene que ver con los modelos de negocio y es una asimetría de información entre cómo las startups se ven a sí mismas trabajando con los gobiernos y cómo los gobiernos ven a las startups, especialmente las digitales. A veces no se entienden o no están hablando en la misma frecuencia y eso evita que se tenga el diálogo y la comunicación mínima indispensable para hacer una estrategia GovTech realidad. La tercera, ya lo decía antes, son las barreras que tienen que ver con contrataciones públicas y sobre todo, esto tiene que ver con los procesos y regulaciones muy complejas de contrataciones que hay, que por su naturaleza favorecen a las grandes empresas, por ejemplo, que tienen grandes áreas jurídicas que sí se pueden aventar un año negociando, contra un startup que tal vez tiene un abogado que tiene que hacer 1000 cosas al mismo tiempo. Y también la seguridad de las personas encargadas de hacer contrataciones en el gobierno, de contratar tecnologías que son nuevas. Y la cuarta son las barreras que tienen que ver con inversión. Y por un lado es la aversión al riesgo que los inversionistas, sobre todo del lado privado, tienen a compañías que contratan y a las cuales les pagan los gobiernos. Riesgos que tienen que ver con corrupción, especialmente cuando hablas en regiones como la nuestra, en donde es un problema grave, y por supuesto la escasez de fondos que siempre hay y que dar fondos a una iniciativa GovTech o a cualquiera significa que le estás dejando dar a otra, ¿no? Entonces necesitamos ser el caso con pesos y centavos, con retorno de inversión de que esto es buena idea.
Perfecto. Pues nos has contado los instrumentos, las barreras y también sé que habéis publicado, ¿no?, una guía un poco como con recomendaciones clave para avanzar en esta colaboración tan importante. Entonces, ahora sí, por favor, nos puedes dar así como rápidamente, que también nos vamos un poco de tiempo, las claves más relevantes que deben seguir los gobiernos para promocionar estos ecosistemas.
Por supuesto, pues justo en el informe que sacamos mañana, en conjunto lo que van a poder encontrar son 30 recomendaciones bien específicas en 3 grandes ámbitos de acción que de manera no sorpresiva son lo que les dije, ¿no? Recomendaciones para los gobiernos, para las startups y para las contrataciones. Para los gobiernos, además de lo que ya dije, lo que vemos en este momento de la madurez del ecosistema GovTech es que necesitamos impulsar compromisos políticos de alto nivel, tanto a manera nacional como en foros internacionales, por ejemplo, en la Alianza para el Gobierno Abierto, en el G20, en la OCDE, etcétera, etcétera. Realizar eventos, encuentros y conferencias GovTech, paneles como los que estamos ahorita para dar a conocer cuáles son los impactos que se pueden tener y cuáles son los beneficios de que un gobierno, dentro de los millones de cosas que tienen que hacer, decida hacer una cosa nueva que se llama GovTech y cómo le pueden ayudar. Y sobre todo para los gobiernos, establecer acuerdos interministeriales y equipos que puedan coordinar todas las cosas que yo les acabo de contar y que también mis compañeros les han contado antes. Algo bien importante es que nuestra visión de GovTech no se trata de hacer algo nuevo, se trata de coordinar diversas áreas de gobierno, la digital, la de datos, la de gobierno abierto, la de apoyo a emprendedores, y potencializar y alinear lo que están haciendo para que tenga mucho mayor impacto el esfuerzo que ya de por sí hacen. En la segunda parte de oferta a las startups pymes, además también de las cámaras y colectivos que les comentaba, lo que vemos sobre todo es la necesidad de que los inversores de riesgo del sector privado entiendan que invertir en startups GovTech es una buena idea. Y para eso necesitamos algo súper importante, que es medir el retorno de inversión y el impacto social que estas startups tienen al trabajar con los gobiernos. En este caso no se trata solo de ver cuánto dinero estás recibiendo como inversionista, sino también cuánto impacto y valor público estás generando, lo cual nos da una ventana y una ventaja al hacer el caso de necesidad de inversión en el ecosistema. Y por último, en la parte de contrataciones, sobre todo vamos a experimentar con metodologías ágiles. Adecuar las regulaciones existentes, por ejemplo, diseñando licitaciones que tengan porcentajes mínimos para la participación de startups intensivas en tecnología, incentivar políticas de contrataciones abiertas para minimizar los riesgos de corrupción y entender bien cómo contrata el gobierno, implementar mecanismos de compra pública innovadoras, sobre todo para tecnología que no necesariamente ha sido probada o comprada dentro del gobierno, e implementar algunos esquemas que den la seguridad a los gobiernos de lo que están contratando, como los sandboxes o las playas regulatorias. Entonces, estos son solo algunas de las 30 recomendaciones, pero vemos que con este menú de opciones, un gobierno puede hacer una estrategia GovTech contundente, robusta y sobre todo que tenga el impacto que esperamos.
Muchísimas gracias. La verdad es que son recomendaciones muy buenas y creo que muy necesarias, ¿no? Así que, bueno, lo dejamos aquí. Destacar que España lidera el índice de madurez en Iberoamérica, pero que, bueno, a nivel europeo todavía sabemos que países como Reino Unido pues, nos llevan la delantera como por gran diferencia, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, en la siguiente conversación vamos a preguntarnos cómo podemos seguir avanzando y un poco para hilarlo con lo que decía Enrique, poniendo foco en cómo los fondos europeos también nos pueden apoyar en este desarrollo de capacidades de GovTech. Así que nada, muchas gracias y aquí lo dejo.
Perfecto, Rocío, muchas gracias. Enrique, un auténtico placer. Gracias por estar conectado aquí. Yo realmente espero que estas sugerencias lleguen a muchos gobiernos. Os estaba escuchando y digo, sí, check, check, check. Ciertamente esto es importante. Y de hecho, precisamente como bien decía Rocío hace un momento, Europa escucha. Europa escucha y una de las cosas que hace es invertir parte de los fondos de ayuda precisamente para este tipo de iniciativas de digitalización. Hace poco además la propia Comisión ilustraba, ¿no?, la gran brecha digital que había en Europa a todos los niveles, no solamente a nivel de gobiernos. Y bueno, tenemos el famoso Fondo de Recuperación de Europa y la Agenda de España Digital. Precisamente para hablar de esto, de cómo podemos usar los fondos europeos para apoyar el desarrollo del potencial de GovTech, tenemos a nuestros siguientes invitados. De nuevo, le damos la bienvenida a Idoia Ortiz, directora del AI Public Tech Lab, y nuestro invitado, Alejandro Tosina, Senior Manager en Silo. Alejandro, Idoia, un placer teneros. Idoia, otra vez de vuelta. Alejandro, encantado. Idoia, todo tuyo.
Muchísimas gracias, Alex. La verdad es que no podíamos terminar esta sesión de hoy sin hablar de los fondos europeos de recuperación. Todos sabemos que la digitalización es una parte sustantiva, vertical, absolutamente prioritaria en la asignación de estos fondos y la digitalización del sector público es una parte sustantiva de este tema. Por eso queríamos hablar con Alejandro Tosina de Silo, experto en estos temas tan complejos, ¿no? Y mi primera pregunta creo que es la pregunta del millón, la que se pregunta, yo creo que todas las instituciones con las que trabajamos. ¿Cómo va a ser la asignación de esos 140.000 millones, 72.000 y pico millones que van a ser de ayudas directas? ¿Sabes algo más que lo que ha salido en las noticias? ¿Nos puedes dar alguna idea novedosa o alguna noticia novedosa al respecto?
Pues muchas gracias, Idoia, por invitarnos a participar. Y lo cierto es que es una muy buena idea y muy buena pregunta y espero dar algunas respuestas, ¿no?, dentro de lo que ahora mismo sabemos. Ahora mismo estos fondos están pendientes de ajuste fino, es decir, tenemos ya cierta información, hay pues ya un cierto compromiso de determinadas temáticas, de determinadas áreas de actuación, pero no está todavía cerrado ni el reparto final de programas, ni de organismos gestores, ni de temática de actuación. La información que tenemos es imperfecta, cosas que se van saliendo a la prensa, informaciones que se van preguntando a determinadas personas y van al final pues se va montando un poco lo que es la foto de este programa, ¿no? Un programa que es bastante jugoso, ya que se van a recibir unos 140.000 millones de euros en España, ¿no? Contando con unos 72.700 millones que irán vía transferencia y 67.300 en préstamos. ¿De acuerdo? O sea, son cantidades importantes, ¿no? Además, estas cantidades se tienen que invertir entre 2021 y 2023. Esto ya es un cambio respecto a la tradicional programación europea que va cada 7 años, ¿no? Entonces, eso también marca un poco un cierto interés en que sea una ejecución lo más rápida posible, ¿no? Para solucionar los problemas de la crisis, ¿no? que está llegando, ¿no? No obstante, evidentemente, la financiación europea tiene que pasar por una serie de filtros, una serie de trámites, y no esperamos que lleguen los dineros a los Estados miembros hasta pues, final de julio del año que viene, más o menos, ¿no? Tiene que pasar por comisión, por consejo, ¿no? Otra cosa que hay que decir es que aunque hay que invertir los fondos entre 2021 y 2023, tenemos el N+3 también, es decir, habrá 3 años más para poder ejecutar, es decir, habrá que adjudicar en esos 3 años y comprometer esos fondos, pero luego hay un margen más para poder ejecutarlos, ¿no? Entonces, pues bueno, pues sigue un poco la lógica de los fondos estructurales. Todavía no hay reglamento escrito para gestionar estos fondos, pero indudablemente va a ser muy parecido a los fondos estructurales que estamos acostumbrados a manejar. El FEDER, el Fondo Social Europeo, el FEADER, todos estos, ¿no? Al final, este dinero tiene que llegar para subvencionar grandes proyectos, ¿de acuerdo? Van a ser préstamos, subvenciones para proyectos que supongan pues, realmente aumentar la resiliencia y la recuperación de los Estados miembros. Van a ser grandes inversiones públicas, ¿no? Y reformas. Entonces, son proyectos que hay que presentar a Bruselas y tendrán que ser aprobados por la Comisión, indudablemente, ¿no? Y en ello están ahora mismo las administraciones públicas trabajando. Y al final, después de todo esto, ¿qué se va a financiar? Pues se va a financiar muchas cosas. Es decir, al final pues, hay un montón de iniciativas que se quieren potenciar y hay una serie de objetivos fundamentales que van a marcar lo que es la ejecución de estos proyectos. Primero es la promoción de la cohesión económica, social, territorial de los Estados miembros, como pasa con los fondos estructurales. También, por supuesto, lo que es la mitigación de los problemas que están viniendo por la crisis, es decir, el impacto social, económico que estamos teniendo en forma de empleo, en forma de falta de crecimiento, ¿no? Y luego también fortalecer la resiliencia económica y social frente a crisis, ¿no? Frente a esta situación. Y por último, pues también apoyar transiciones ecológicas y digitales, que son un poco las grandes áreas temáticas un poco en las que se podrían englobar los distintos proyectos, ¿no? Al final también hay que basarse en lo que se está apuntando en el semestre europeo, ¿no? Pues hay una serie de prioridades que se están apuntando y que habrá que seguir también, pero vamos, son también muy generales. Son la digitalización, la transición ecológica, pues la mejora de la coordinación de la administración pública y su modernización, el apoyo al empleo, a las pymes, son al final grandes líneas que no van a salir de ahí. Al final esas iniciativas van a ir por esas líneas, ¿no? Para organizar un poco todo esto, tantas temáticas y tantos intereses, ¿no? Pues la Comisión Europea ha lanzado una guía que ha repartido a los Estados miembros, en el que, bueno, no obliga a seguir determinadas directrices, pero sí las recomienda encarecidamente, ¿no? Y al final hay como 7 grandes líneas temáticas que van a ser las que marquen un poco las actuaciones, ¿no? Entonces, de cara a posicionarnos para esas futuras actuaciones, pues habrá que ver que se va a trabajar en la modernización de la administración pública, en la conectividad del 5G, educación y formación de los empleados, la economía del dato, el transporte sostenible, la eficiencia energética y también lo que es las energías renovables, ¿no? Son un poco las 7 grandes áreas temáticas en las que la Comisión recomienda a los Estados que dediquen los recursos que van a recibir. Y al final, ¿cómo se va a gestionar esto? Pues va a ser muy parecido seguramente, sin mucha duda, a lo que es la gestión de los fondos estructurales. Habrá pues una cogestión entre gobierno y comunidades autónomas. Ya tendremos a los distintos organismos gestores tradicionales de fondos posicionando proyectos, posicionando programas, iniciativas, retos y voluntades para gestionar y ejecutar esos fondos, ¿no? Y poder generar el impacto que cada uno en su área quiere tener, ¿no? Y por último, bueno, pues a corto plazo van a ser en las próximas semanas. El 15 de octubre es una fecha bastante clave porque se enviarán los primeros borradores a Bruselas, ¿no? Eso no quiere decir que acabe el mundo del 15 de octubre, es decir, se seguirán trabajando y se seguirán puliendo hasta que al final acaben llegando los fondos a segunda mitad del año que viene seguramente, ¿no? Pero cuando tengamos ya esos borradores, entonces ya podremos concretar mucho más de lo que he ido un poco desgranando de la información imperfecta y heterogénea que hemos ido recopilando en estas últimas semanas, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Hombre, a mí me preocupa un par de cosas que has dicho, ¿no? Si estamos diciendo que vamos a tener una estructura de gobernanza parecida a lo que hemos tenido antes, si nos quedamos con lo que hemos hecho antes, estamos un poco mal, ¿no? España en los últimos, en lo que fue el 2014-2020, en las ayudas que eran 50 y pico mil millones, o sea, no llegan a esos 70.000. O sea, a nivel de asignaciones está al 80%, el 20 de junio estaba al 80%. A nivel de gasto, de ejecutado, estábamos a un 35%. O sea, eso quiere decir que la maquinaria española no está funcionando para toda la gestión de este tipo de fondos, ¿no? Entonces, sabemos que esta vez es verdad que van a ser ayudas 100%, por lo tanto, esa parte de que parte del dinero se tenía que poner 50 o 20% que tenían que poner las comunidades autónomas no va a estar, pero ¿qué otras dos barreras, y brevemente porque ya no nos queda mucho tiempo, crees que se dieron en el anterior periodo y que no se pueden repetir otra vez en este proceso de asignación y de ejecución de estos fondos de recuperación?
Vale. A ver, no debemos despreciar el efecto de la última hora. Es decir, al final todavía no ha acabado el plazo de adjudicación, el final de este año, y como todos sabemos, al final será la avalancha, ¿no?, de proyectos y de actuaciones, ¿no? A ver, indudablemente no lo hemos hecho bien, es decir, los números están ahí, no somos de los últimos en ejecución presupuestaria en fondos estructurales en este periodo de programación, pero, a ver, yo no diría que ha habido como ningún gran problema o así en capital letters, ¿no? Es decir, hay muchas cosas que han ido sumando y que hacen que la ejecución no sea la deseable a estas alturas. Podríamos hablar del retraso que se produjo al principio del periodo de programación en adjudicar los fondos, de establecer los baremos intermedios, es decir, por una serie de circunstancias quizá políticas o quizá administrativas, al final ha habido un pequeño retraso o gran retraso en este periodo de programación en poner en marcha toda la maquinaria, ¿no? Luego también se habla de la burocracia, es decir, siempre se nos echa en cara a los españoles que somos muy burocráticos. Yo estuve varios años trabajando en administración pública y tuve que sufrir mucho lo que era la adjudicación de los fondos, ¿no? Perdón, que me haya por teléfono. Y al final, pues sí, está ahí la burocracia, pero hay que saber manejarla. Los profesionales de la función pública española saben manejarlo y, pues hay que programarlo y hay que ejecutar, ¿no? Yo creo que el principal punto lo has dicho tú, se trata de la cofinanciación. Es un problema serio que se ha afianzado en estos últimos años, ¿no? ¿Por qué? Porque al final, por cada euro que te da Bruselas, España o el Estado miembro tiene que poner un porcentaje de dinero, ¿no? Es decir, en España Bruselas financia entre el 80 y el 50%, entre el 50% y el 80% de las inversiones o de las actuaciones. ¿Qué pasa? En una comunidad autónoma como Andalucía, pues paga el 80% por el PIB y por la situación socioeconómica. En Valencia, en Madrid y Cataluña, pues es el 50%. ¿Qué sucede? Que para una inversión, si Bruselas me da un millón de euros, yo tengo que poner otro millón con fondos propios o endeudarme. Y hemos vivido una época en los últimos años en la que se limitaba mucho lo que era el gasto público y la propia acceso a la deuda, ¿no? Había limitaciones al endeudamiento de entidades públicas, ¿no? Por lo tanto, es difícil encontrar esa cofinanciación y suele ser un problema para los organismos gestores, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que algunas decisiones que se están tomando últimamente por parte de la Comisión Europea, por ejemplo, en los fondos de respuesta al coronavirus, ¿no?, que se pudo ampliar al 100% la financiación con fondos europeos, o la flexibilidad de la reprogramación, va a permitir que esto se pueda solucionar en el futuro si se mantiene esa política o esas medidas, ¿no? Si no se mantiene, evidentemente volveremos al principio, es decir, a tener que buscar euros de debajo de las piedras para intentar cofinanciar el dinero que nos venga de Bruselas, ¿no? Yo creo que esos son los tres grandes problemas o barreras, fundamentalmente este último, el de la cofinanciación.
Muchísimas gracias, Alejandro. Creo, como he dicho al principio, no podíamos dejar de hablar de este tema. Ojalá seamos capaces de aprovechar la oportunidad que nos está dando o nos estamos dando desde Europa. Y aquí lo dejo. Muchísimas gracias, Alejandro, y todo tuyo, Alex.
Muchas gracias, Idoia. Alejandro, un placer. Muchas gracias por compartir eso. Yo estaba pensando, y por daros una perspectiva distinta, ¿no? Parte de esos fondos que se van a dar de recuperación han salido de los programas de Horizon Europe que van destinados a startups. Entonces, ahora vamos a ver la gracia de cómo se mueve la bolita y por dónde cae, ¿no? Porque al final también afecta al otro lado, ¿no?, del GovTech, ¿no?, que son las empresas tecnológicas. Okay, so we're nearly there. I want to actually welcome the whole team at the IE Public Tech Lab because you've done an extraordinary job at putting this whole track together and going from this global perspective, then narrowing it down to the development, the support, then the actual regional and national level. So basically, I would love to hear your input, a little bit of the highlights of the interviews that you've been involved with. And I already have Idoia with me. So Idoia, what is your take from the interviews we've seen so far?
Yes, from my interview with Tracy, I would say that GovTech works for all and at all levels of maturity. So it's worth it to try.
Nice. I believe we have Beatriz around here. Bea? There we go.
Yeah, so Arune has said a lot of things, but I would like to highlight the part of the empathy, building appreciation between governments and startups, because the rest of the things, normally we mention them, but we always forget this basic part about people.
That's actually quite important. We keep getting into the forest without looking at the actual people. Sophia, what's your take?
Yeah, I'd sum up the conversation with Rose saying that there are great GovTech programs flourishing. The incentive for startups to contribute with solutions to the government market is huge, but ultimately governments are the ones responsible for upholding these kind of ecosystems, offering a structure for them and for seeking strategies for their digital transformation.
Yeah, you should send that letter to someone. Rocío, ¿cuál es tu perspectiva?
Bueno, yo un poco por concluir la conversación con Enrique diría que el momento actual, ¿no? Pre y post-COVID y más concretamente este espacio GovTech es una súper oportunidad, ¿no? Para que los gobiernos rediseñen la forma en que proveen sus servicios a unos ciudadanos que cada vez son más exigentes y piden nuevas respuestas, ¿no? Eso sería un poco mi conclusión.
Yo estoy expectante a ver un poco cómo decís, es una grandísima oportunidad lo que tenemos ahora, o sea que, a ver, Juan Pablo, ¿cuál es tu perspectiva?
Y a mí también me gustaría remarcar la enorme oportunidad en la que se encuentra España para poder corregir los errores del pasado, mejorando los procesos de financiación con Bruselas y aprovechando para fomentar e incentivar un país con instituciones públicas más digitales e inteligentes para el futuro.
Phenomenal. Well, team, you did an extraordinary job. Thank you so much for your effort. Thank you so much for putting this together. It was a pleasure having you. And I also want to thank our speakers, so both Tracy, Arune, Roy, Enrique, and Alejandro, for their time, for sharing their insights around the GovTech space, which, as we were just saying, it's definitely a huge opportunity. And I know as a Spaniard, as someone living the technology space also, I really, really hope we progress fast here because it's much needed. And without this, I would like to remind everyone that this event was developed within the context of the GovTech Lab Madrid, and it's a project that's co-founded between the Madrid region, the Comunidad de Madrid, and the European Regional Development Fund. And with this, it was my absolute pleasure being here with you and sharing this incredible topic that I'm very, very passionate about also. And I believe the whole team is also extremely passionate. So thank you all and see you next time. Enjoy.
Thanks. Bye-bye.